Hi, my name is Catherine, and today I'll be talking to you about the play The Tragedy of Coriolanus by William Shakespeare. I will give you a backstory, synopsis, and share some what I think are fascinating insights into the play. And as you listen, look for parallels to today's modern world. Coriolanus is one of several of Shakespeare's plays set in the ancient world. He also wrote Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Timon of Athens, Pericles of Tyre, and also Cymbeline, which takes place in the Roman era of ancient Britain. When we think about ancient Rome, we usually picture, say, the Roman Empire controlling the entire Mediterranean Sea and beyond. But Coriolanus predates the height of the Roman Empire by about 500 years, when Rome barely controlled anything other than the territory outside its own city wall. So Rome was still a small city-state at the time, just the darkest, reddest area of this map. So for context, here's a timeline. We're in this yellow box area right now, 493 to 488 BC. It would be another 200 years before Rome conquers all of Italy and then moves on to defeating Carthage and expanding across the entire Mediterranean Sea into Western Europe and Northern Africa and into the time of the Caesars. But during our play, Rome is just still a small city on the banks of the Tiber River, about 20 miles northwest of the Alban Hills, which is the site of the ancient Latin capital of Alba Longa and the birthplace of the founders of Rome. At the start of our play, Rome is about 260 years old, roughly about the same age as the United States, and is in a state of great turmoil, upheaval, and change because it's just 17 years into a major regime change from a monarchy to a republic. Rome is surrounded by a wall that was built by the sixth king, Servius Tullius, to protect the city from the surrounding city-states such as the Sabines, the Etruscans, the Samnites, and Neris being the Volsci, who will play a prominent part in our play. At the heart of the play is a story of the famous Roman soldier Caius Marcius, who fought at the siege of the Volscian city of Coriolanus in the year 493 BC under the leadership of General Postumus Cominius Aruncus. Yes, another character named Postumus. Caius Marcius's valor earns him the toponym or geographically related nickname Coriolanus, named after the city of Coriolanus, which makes his mummy dearest very proud. Though the city's exact location has been lost to history, it is about 10 miles south of Rome and between it and the Volscian capital of Antium. Coriolanus' arch-enemy is the Volscian general Aufidius, who says he hates the Roman soldier Coriolanus so much he would violate even the protections of sanctuary to kill his enemy if given the opportunity. That's especially ironic when Coriolanus later seeks asylum among the Volscians, although in truth we will see that Coriolanus' worst enemy is probably himself. Speaking of sanctuary and asylum, by the time the play opens, Rome has compassed all 7 hills of its city, partly because it took in its refugees and bandits and conquered peoples and let them settle in an area known as asylum, where if they demonstrated they could be good citizens, they would get to stay. It's also where we get our concepts of sanctuary and asylum today, but there is very little feeling of sanctuary in Rome at the time of the play opening. To understand the mentality and culture of Rome at the opening of our play, we have to go back a few years to the last several kings before we jump into our play. This play is also particularly timely because of its themes of honor and nobility, law and order, the wealth gap and civil disobedience, pride and shame, especially one's social status, and especially the intertwined natures of toxic masculinity and toxic femininity, especially motherhood and manipulation. Let's look at some of the details. For the first 250 years or so of its history, after the death of Romulus, Rome was governed by a king, which was elected for life by the Senate. The Senate consisted of members of the patrician class, which were the wealthy upper-class noble families, about 50 to 100 of them at the start of this time. These patricians were known from large families known as gents, from which we get our English words gentry, genteel, and gentle as in aristocratic gentlemen. The lower-class plebeians, the working class, mostly artisans, craftsmen, farmers, laborers, traders, they had no direct representation, and neither did the slaves, of course. There was also the office of prefect, which was appointed by the king as a lifetime appointment, and essentially someone who was second in command in charge when the king is away from the city. The citizens, which were the patricians and the plebeians, were divided into 3 main tribes. Each of those tribes were divided into 10 curia each, and within those 10 curiae you had 100 centuries of soldiers that they were supposed to provide to the king during times of war. So at any given moment, the king of Rome could easily command 3,000 soldiers into battle. In other words, it was a hyper-masculine culture, and Rome's hyper-focus on militarisms, long before the days of Caesar and prevalent through all 5 acts of our play, you can see it caused it to be an empire long before it actually declared itself to be one. We can also see the patriarchy reinforced by names. If you thought the Henry plays were bad for names, the Romans were worse. They had only about 30 different first names known as praenomen, or forenames, and since sons tend to be named after their fathers, only about 18 of these names were in common use. The family names, the gents, came next. So in contrast to modern English names, the second name listed is usually the nomen or the family name. Many Romans also had cognomens or nicknames such as, of course, Caius Marcius's Coriolanus, named after the city of Coriolanus. Women had it even worse and were usually given a variation in the family name. Like if your last name was Smith and Jones, you and your sisters would all be named Smithia or Jonesy. Or worse, if they ran out of actual names, then they were further dehumanized and just given a number, such as Septis or Octavia. Things changed in the favor of the plebeians for a little bit when the 5th king, Tarquinius the Elder, was assassinated by the sons of his predecessor, who were angry at the thought of being bypassed for kingship. Upon his death, his wife Tanaquil kept it a secret and made her slave, Servius Tullius, as regent. It kind of helped there were divine portents of the birth of the slave, but essentially, elevating a slave to the status of a king still rocked the ancient Roman world. Now, the queen soon then wed Tullius to one of her daughters, all of whom were named Tarquinia, and during Tullius's reign he performed many reforms, including expanding the Senate to 300, increasing the size of the patrician class by adding more minor families, and most significantly, he generally improved the lot of the poor by organizing a census so he could give them voting rights. Some sources also say he was elected without the approval of the Senate and without a popular vote, a factor we'll see come up in our play later. Perhaps most upset were his daughters, both named Tullia, Tullia Major and Tullia Minor, and his big mistake was marrying these 2 daughters to the 2 sons or grandsons of the previous king. The younger daughter and the oldest son each killed their own spouses, then married each other, and then killed the king and put the elder son as the next king, the 7th king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud and Arrogant. Tarquinius the Proud justified his act by saying the previous king had reigned without approval of the people, and then he proceeded to overturn many other reforms designed to help those same plebeian class people. Tarquin was also unpopular with the nobles, who resented his constant taxing for wars and building projects. They also did not take kindly to the fact that Tarquinius did not bury the previous king, and that he proceeded to kill dozens of senators whose loyalty he questioned. Minor things. So in 509 BC, the nobles took an opportunity to overthrow him when one of the king's sons, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, the daughter of a nobleman, who afterwards took her own life in shame. This rape is actually featured in several of Shakespeare's plays, especially in Titus Andronicus. In revenge for the rape, Lucretia's husband and her father and her cousin, who was a relative of the king, decided to overthrow the king and set up their own government, a republic, in which they made themselves co-councils. Most of the former king's powers were then transferred to the 2 co-councils, including the right to veto decisions made by the Senate. Each council also had to take an oath to never try to claim absolute authority or kingship ever again, and if he abused his power, well, he could be prosecuted when his 1-year term was up. Now, afterwards, the Senate would elect the co-councils, one chosen by the senators themselves, and the others voted on directly from the patrician class. As you can see, the plebeians and the slaves still had no representation. They also created a few other positions, including the legate, and kept the prefect position, and a dictator, which was a temporary term just in case they needed someone to take command of an army, for example. Several characters in our play did manage to get into some of these positions. It's important to note that the overthrow of the kings was thus entirely motivated and orchestrated by the patricians for the patricians. The plebeians, having lost what little power they gained under King Servius Tullus, had only one other recourse available to them, and that was essentially to revolt, to secede. And they essentially staged a massive work strike and a boycott, and they relocated themselves to a nearby mountain until their grievances were heard. Their primary grievance was that there was massive debt from famine and a grain shortage, causing many of them to be forced into slavery when they could not pay their debts. Grain was imported from Sicily, but some patricians, including Caius Marcius, said that the plebeian reform should be overturned before they pass out any grain gratis, or free. Historically, the grain shortage actually occurred after the siege of Coriolanus, but in Shakespeare's time, wealthy aristocrats were fencing in large tracts of common land, historically used by farmers for grazing sheep and cattle and raising crops, so he had some motivation to mess with the timeline. The first such plebeian secession occurs in 494 BC, just at the start of our play. It ends when the Senate grants the plebeians representation by the creation of 5 tribunes elected by the people for the people. The tribunes would be given direct access to the laws, which previously were kept private. They would have participation in any of the legislative process. Tribunes were immune to arbitrary arrest, and most importantly, they could veto any new legislation, although they still could not propose new laws. And they are personally sacrosanct. That takes us to the beginning of our play, and we'll go over and talk about that in part 2.